$72 million in the school aid fund now into Detroit. There was a report last week that broke that down to about $50 less in state money per kid. Is that accurate, and do you feel it's fair?
Well, again, I think Citizens Research Council does a lot of good work. That could be in the ballpark. Again, we need to finalize the numbers. But what I would say is we've made some very large investments statewide in education. So this is something that I think is appropriate, because if you look at the debt the school district actually owes, in many respects, most of those obligations come back to being a state obligation. So in ways, this is debt that we're backing up or we owe in some fashion, and so we're just being more proactive to pay it versus making it go through a crisis situation. So I view this, instead of making this a crisis, let's be proactive, let's solve a problem, and let's solve it the right way. And I feel good that we have hopefully a strong economy and good resources to invest in schools throughout all of Michigan. We've increased education spending for K-12 each year I've been governor. Yes.
Yeah, Governor Ann Zaniewski from the Free Press. I have a two-part question. How does this setup affect current charter authorizers, and then secondly, the Detroit education manager? So that person will be able to replace or find new authorizers if schools aren't performing well. Could that possibly mean then traditional public schools could become charters? Does that leave the door open for that?
Yeah, what I would say is with respect to authorizers, this legislation is not really geared at changing the authorizer methodology. Again, we have an established process that involves the Michigan Department of Education and such, and so we expect them to continue to do their work. As a practical matter, in terms of if there's a situation where a school closes, the Detroit education manager is the person that would essentially run the proposal process and put a school out to bid if it was appropriate to have someone else come run it. And again, that could be any of the variations I talked about. It could be a charter potentially being closed, a new DPS school being closed, and it could be replaced by either one of those two choices. It's really who's going to put the best proposal together to give the best outcome to the kids. This is very much based on a merit process. This isn't about favoring one particular type charters or the new Detroit district schools. This is about what's the best answer.
Governor Roger Weber from Channel 4. Would you agree, at the very least, that this could be an uphill battle in the legislature, especially because a lot of lawmakers already voted for the grand bargain? And we're already hearing the word bailout in Lansing. Is this a bailout?
Yeah, again, I would put a context on this, Roger. I expect I will probably get some people yelling at me from all sides. This is what happens when you take bold moves to do things to reinvent things. I think this is appropriate. And again, it was based on good thoughts coming out of many people in Detroit itself. With respect to the dollars, though, again, if you look at much of the debt owed by the Detroit public schools today, these are bonds that are backed by state credit. And in many respects, if you have a collapse or we continued on this path and had a huge issue with Detroit public schools, much of that is going to come back and be an issue for the state of Michigan in any case. Let's be proactive, let's be thoughtful, let's come up with real payment plans that are acceptable in the sense that we can continue to provide good education and hopefully better education to all the kids of Michigan.
What do you say to the critics out there that say there's already been plenty of financial managers who have come into DPS, haven't been able to do anything, helped create this debt? The EAA hasn't been that successful. What makes you think this is going to work?
Well, I think that was, I brought up that point in terms of myself, saying that I didn't want to continue to see, emergency managers in Detroit Public School continuing. We've had enough. And one of the questions was, let's change the question and instead of simply looking at Detroit Public Schools, let's look at education in Detroit. Because that's one of the major issues we have is if you look at the performance, we're not seeing great performance either from DPS or charter schools. And in many cases, we may have more seats or supply than we have demand for students, demand from the students and their parents. So that's where the Education Commission is critically important to say, how do we improve academic performance? How do we create an environment for better financial performance? And by broadening the question, I think this is how we help resolve the question. So I think this is a good way to approach it. One comment on EAA I'll give you is one of the recommendations in the coalition report was to look at how it could be part of the school reform office or the school reform district. That's something we're looking hard at. I just didn't make specific comments on that. I think it's appropriate to look at, but I issued an executive order that's not effective yet. So what I would say is this process goes on, we'll be looking at the EAA as to how it might be more closely incorporated or integrated into the school reform office and or district.
Is there a chance that the EAA could go away?
Well, again, it could potentially take a different format given the school reform practices that we're modifying at this point in time. I don't want to be too far ahead of that because the executive order, I've issued it, but it's not effective yet. So I want it to be effective before we get into more dialogue on that.
Mr. Stephanie? WWJ. A number of community leaders, as you know, and others in this community met for a long time with the coalition to come up with the recommendations. Just wondering if any of the recommendations will be used, and what do you say to those who really invested time hoping to make a change and be part of the change in DPS? What do you say to them who say we've worked all this time and we actually don't approve of the plan? What do you say to them who came together and really tried to come up with a plan?
Yeah, well, if you look at it in terms of dealing with the debt question, we're following basically the same parameters of what they wanted to do. If you looked at creating the Detroit Education Commission and an education manager, we're following that same process. If you're looking at common enrollment, that's a very similar process. So if you look at most of these, and again, we'll be happy to follow up with you later of the coalition recommendations, I think there's a very strong alignment. A number of them I didn't mention, that's why I said at the beginning, we're supportive of them. In many cases, again, we may have some variation, but they don't belong in state law. So in terms of my presentation, I don't think they were really appropriate here today, but we'll be happy to follow up with you and talk about some of those other things. So in large part, I would think the majority of these things we're in pretty close alignment. I think there are some governance differences, and I think that's appropriate, though. To be open with you, is we reached out to the coalition with people. We've talked to many members, and I, again, appreciate their really hard work. We also talked to legislators and people across the state, and I think there's an understanding that if the state is making a huge investment of literally hundreds of millions of dollars, there needs to be some state involvement in the oversight process.
I think if I might just follow up, we began with dialogue, working alongside with the coalition, and we continue to do so. We believe that we're in alignment on many, many issues, but we will continue to work with them. The coalition chairs had no expectation that Lansing, so to speak, would accept all of their 24 recommendations, nor do we expect that they'll accept the entirety of our recommendations. But they remain an integral part of the stakeholder community and remain very positive on working with us.
Yeah, and we expect that to be part of the process. Now this will go to the legislature, we hope, and there'll be good chances for the coalition or their members to come share their thoughts and process. And again, this is where I think you'll find some different views and perspectives from people around the state. Again, this is part of the legislative process. That's why I made the comment that hopefully people will take the time to look at the detail, not jump too quickly to conclusions. And if you really look at this, I think there's a lot of good, thoughtful work that is, in fact, based on a lot of good, thoughtful work from the coalition.
Governor, thank you. What happens to old DPS when it pays its debt off? What happens to old co?
Yeah, essentially, it most likely will go away. Again, it's there to really repay debt.
Well, what about the millage attached to it? Does that just disappear too?
Well, again, that's a whole question that as we get through that point, we'll be examining the question of the millage. The millage most likely, there's a renewal question in terms of when it comes up. So again, we're looking, you're out in the early 2020s to look at those kind of questions.
Yes, hi, Governor. Sean Lewis, Detroit News. As you know, right now, there are about 200 protesters from the Detroit Federation of Teachers up in Lansing, and one of their basic arguments is that it hasn't been addressed anywhere, the class size, the lack of supplies, teacher pay. One of the things they're chanting is 55 is a speed limit, not a class size. And I was wondering how you would address that, their concerns.
Yeah, well, first of all, again, setting class sizes in state legislation, I'm not sure that's the appropriate place. Again, those are many issues. And again, one of the ways to deal with any of those kind of issues is by dealing with the debt question in DPS. And I think that's what we've really focused in on, is helping with that. The other thing I would say is I think it's too bad to have them out protesting at this point. Again, people have strong feelings, and I appreciate people having strong feelings about education. But the real focus needs to be on what's best for the kids. And again, the format of having schools closed today to go protest, I'm not sure how that's helping the kids. The other piece is they're protesting before they even heard what I was saying. And again, that's something that I really ask people to be thoughtful about, is don't just react to the fact that I did a presentation. I hope people take the time, if they're in Detroit, to take the coalition report and compare it to what we did and look for the alignment, all the things that have happened. And for people outstate Michigan, I hope they take the time to say, this is another step in making sure we're a great state by making sure we're investing in kids that need a better outcome in terms of academics.
We're going to come to Chris down here, and then Ann, you again.
Chris Claybrook on Reduced Service. We now have, with this, we would have 3 districts where we've essentially shuffled the debt onto the local millage, and they're essentially shuffled that onto the rest of the school districts. Is this going to be a continuing pattern for dealing with schools in financial trouble?
The first of all is we're working hard to make sure we avoid these situations to begin with in terms of debt. Again, we've had it in limited cases with Highland Park and Muskegon Heights where we've addressed those, and I think we followed a similar pattern of old co, new co, and that is working out. But what I'd say is we've called for legislation, and we want to work with districts on early warning systems and how to avoid these questions to begin with. That's the best answer. Again, the whole financial manager situation, the emergency manager law, hopefully people have seen it be relatively effective. But the best answer is how do we do good hard work and help support people before we get to that question.
Ann, go ahead. Would any of the labor contracts need to be opened up during this transition and renegotiated?
With the old co, new co transition, no. That would be a successor organization, so it just transfers over.
All right, I'm going to Ross, just one second. For anybody that's on the phone, don't be shy. I know we have a couple of dozen of folks from across the state and country on the line, so please press 0 to get in the queue, and we'll be happy to get your question to the governor. Ross, go ahead.
Good afternoon, sir. Can you talk a bit more about how this is not a bailout? Because I think to a lot of people, if we're shifting this money potentially from other districts to Detroit and it's not coming back, that seems very much like it is a bailout.
Well, again, let's start, before you talk about money, let's talk about the kids. Isn't it important we create a system of success for the children of Detroit? And that has a critical importance to our entire state. And the real question is the current environment is not being successful for them. They want to learn. They want to have opportunity. And if you think it in the long term, it's not just their education, but we want them to have good, well-paying jobs so they can raise their family in the city and watch their kids grow up in the city and watch their kids get a great education. So this is something that I hope all Michiganders have an interest in seeing. The other part of it is I don't view it as a bailout when it's really being done in the context of getting something stable and working well. That's where I was very supportive of the grand bargain. It wasn't about simply putting money into a situation where it was going to continue going downhill. Look at the grand bargain. It got done, and in fact, the mayor and city council took a budget to the Financial Review Commission that had a slight surplus, and they presented a 4-year plan that shows them being successful, although it's still challenging. Again, I don't want to minimize it's all done, but they're working hard, and they're showing positive results now compared to how many years and years and years of problems. We need to look at a similar kind of solution that can work for schools also.
I know we have one question that came in from Simon at WXYZ. He asks, Governor, can you explain, and you touched on this briefly, but what happens to the current emergency manager and the role in either old or new co?
Yeah, in terms of the current emergency manager, what we're assuming at this point is he would continue through the end of his term, which would be the end of next June. And that with this legislation passing effective July 1, that's where we do the separation of old co, new co, and the appointed board that I talked about would take place. We'd have the new City of Detroit Education District, and then we'd go through the transitional plan of having that convert to an elected school board over a period of years.
Thanks. Again, press 0 to get in the queue. Anyone else around the table here? Yep, Ann, go ahead. So the Detroit Education Manager, that person will be responsible for setting the performance metrics, is that correct?
Yeah, what I would say is that's something that the legislation will set some of the parameters in terms of talking about what the criteria may be, and he'll be in charge of implementing that. Also, we'll be getting input from the school reform office as part of that process. But what we'd expect to have is, to be blunt, a letter grade system. And the real question is to have us to eliminate the F schools.
So the legislation is designed to set the parameters so that everyone understands what the circumstances are and what they're going to be measured by. But some degree of discretion for the education manager. so that if a school is rising, you could acknowledge that and watch it rise, and if one is falling rapidly, perhaps intervene a little earlier.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be just the grade, it's the trend line too, in terms of are we achieving particularly student growth.
Don't we have those standards that all schools in the state are supposed to meet? Why do we need different standards in Detroit?
Yeah, what I would say is I hope they're very similar. We've had that discussion though. Currently we have this color code system. And to be open with you, I'm not sure a lot of people are utilizing that or fully understand it. And I think we proposed legislation some time ago, and I think there is interest from the legislators. They've been looking at moving forward legislation to clarify that, to get us to more a letter grade standard. So I hope there's a complement between those two things.
Governor Ken Rodolsky from WJR. Apparently moms and dads in Detroit don't have a lot of confidence in the schools. How are you going to convince them that, hey, this is the fix to, maybe they should take another look at Detroit public schools?
Yeah, and I want them to. Again, that's one of the values of looking at this common enrollment system, because you can provide good information. The other one with the education manager and the commission is this grade system. Again, one of the things that I think has been useful to people, and I think it's been recognized, is what Excellent Schools Detroit's done for some time. About actually, they've had their grading system. I think this would hopefully be more comprehensive in some fashion, but I don't want to criticize them. I appreciate their work. That people use that information to look for schools. So I think by having the grade system go into place through the commission and then having a common enrollment system, hopefully this is starting to create an environment for success. Actually, I'd highlight, I love this school, Davison Elementary Middle School. Those are the techno dragons that are out doing tech support. They're middle school students helping do tech support within the school. I've given them shouts out. I've been in their school. That's a Detroit public school. That's cool. We need more of that.
We're going to go to the first call on the line. James from an education blog. James, you can go ahead with your call if you can hear us.
What plans do you have for handling priority school?
Yeah, in terms of handling priority schools, again, those would be assigned a letter grade, much as everything else, so the education manager would most likely have them in the process, and to be blunt, if they're a priority school, their grade is probably relatively low, and it would be worked through that process. In addition to what the education manager does, is also there is the ability, if it's a priority school, for the school reform office to take action. So you could find action either from the education manager or the school reform office for a priority school.
Great. We're going to take another couple from the phone now. We've got Chris Christoph from Bloomberg. Chris, can you go ahead with your call? Can you hear us, Chris?
Yeah, Governor, forgive me. I couldn't hear all the questions preceding, so if I'm repeating, I wanted to make sure I understand the numbers on this. If you do this division where you're isolating the non-homestead millage, would the state then have to increase its funding to Detroit schools by $72 million to maintain the current level of classroom funding?
What would happen, Chris, you're basically in the right parameter. Roughly the $483 million would move over to Oldco. Roughly the millage amount is $72 million. And what would happen then is it would actually be based on enrollment in the new district, because again, it would come through the normal allowance process. But the state would essentially, if enrollment was even, it would be the $72 million coming through the normal allocation process.
Great. Thank you, Governor. We're going to go to Karen from Reuters in Chicago. Karen, you can go ahead with your call.
Hi. The district has about $2 billion of bonds outstanding. What happens to them? Do they go Oldco, Newco? What millage takes care of those?
Yeah, it depends on which particular bonds you're speaking of. For the ones that are capital related, there's already millages to pay those down, so they're covered. So they have a process to do that. If they're more operating debt bonds, they would move to Oldco, but again, there would be the non-homestead millage to pay those bonds. So the good part is I believe we've got it covered to have a good stream of revenue to make sure the debt is being serviced.
Great. I think we're going to try and do one more from the phone before we come back here. Dave Eggert from AP, you are live.
Hi, Governor. Two quick questions. One, For this to take effect in July 2016, how quickly, when would this legislation need to be approved by? And secondly, how many years do you expect asking a legislator for the additional $72 million to pay off this operating debt?
Yeah, what we'd hope, Dave, is to see the legislation go through by this fall, which would give us time to get set up and hit that timetable I talked about having the Education Commission really be effective of January of 16 and be able to start the process of common enrollment. And then with respect to the old co, new co, that transition would be July 1 of 16. With the end of the emergency managers cycle, the transition to the two districts, the new appointed board. With respect to the debt question on $483 million, yeah, you can do some math at $72 million a year to see it would be for approximately 6-7 years. The part I would add that I actually added is we still would have to calculate some additional debt that needs to be serviced because the new district would also have some transitional losses as they made the changes until they reached a point of stability. And that's a number we're still working on. So it would be somewhat higher than the 483. And so it would take longer than the 7-year period most likely.
Thank you, Governor. We're going to do one last one because it was a repeated one. So Kyle from MLive, you can go ahead with your question, and then I will turn it back to those in the room here.
Hi, Governor. Again, to echo the previous statement about not being able to hear all the questions, if it's already been asked, I apologize. A lot of critics that were outside the Capitol today were saying that this is just a workaround to turn every school in Detroit into a charter. What is your response to that?
Well, I think I was very clear that we're setting up a successor school district that won't have the legacy debt. That the Detroit Public Schools would continue. It would have the same teachers, the same buildings, the same contracts. That would be a successor organization. So I don't know how anyone speculates that it's a charter system.
It will, for all legal purposes, be a brand new, fully incorporated school district. It is not a charter district.
All right, thanks. Jacob, it looks like we have time for one more, maybe depending on how quick you are.
You put a lot of importance on returning the new school district to elected control, but I want to hear your rationale for the other boards that you create, why you will leave them mayor and gubernatorial appointees. You have a lot of control over educational aspects in Detroit going forward.
Yeah, well, I'd say is, again, in a number of communities across the country, even the traditional public school boards appointed. So to have this for the Detroit Education Commission, I believe, is appropriate to make sure that we can get it set up, running appropriately. I view this as part of the process. There would be a huge investment from the state to get this set up and operating, so I think the balance between the mayor and my role is appropriate. And I would expect that to be one of the points of discussion that will go as the legislation goes through the process.
Ingrid, you'll be, sorry, John, go ahead.
Just the DEC, the Detroit Education Commission's focus really is on the issue of quality. We're promoting the best academic experience and opportunity for our students, where the DPS board, the charter operators, what they'd be looking at are how you get there. That's why it's important they have a DPS board that transitions to an elected one, so that they can reflect the desires of the community for curriculum, services offered in the school, and those types of things. The DEC is very narrow in its focus.
All right, Ingrid, you'll be our closer.
Okay. How supportive is the mayor of these plans? There's a lot of room for his involvement in what you've laid out. I mean, is he on board with this?
Well, I would say the mayor will speak for himself on this topic. As a practical mayor, we've had a lot of dialogue with a lot of parties, including the mayor, though, to keep him up to date on this process. But this is the rollout of the whole package. So this is where, again, I hope people take the time to look at all the pieces, but I'm sure the mayor will have some thoughts on this. The coalition members will. Again, I think it's somewhat unfortunate that it's coming at the expense of the kids, is that people were already assuming things before we got a chance to actually say what they were. And so hopefully people will want to work together on this. That's the message, is this shouldn't be about adults. This is about kids, the kids of Detroit, working together. So let's work hard on how we can find common ground on finding solutions for education and having people avoid the fight and blame mode. It's relentless positive action we're working on here.
You know, we actually went through, I was going to actually offer closing comments, but that was probably perfect. So do you have any last words for the group?
No, again, I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. Again, we've covered a lot of information. We're happy to follow up. I am glad to say this hopefully will go through the legislative process. This is where good work happens. So this is just the starting point of a process to build on what the coalition did, the good work they did. And the last thing I would close with is let's use relentless positive action to help the kids of Detroit have an opportunity to share in the comeback of Detroit, and to do it in a way where we can make sure all the kids of Michigan can get a great education and we can have a great long-term outlook for us all. So thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you all. I know that the Governor has to leave now, but for those of you who are around, if there's any follow-up questions, I know John is still here. Harvey can be a resource. We're here happy to help. So thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. Thanks for everyone for joining us on the phone.